What's up, and welcome to Period 7 APUSH exam cram from 1890 to 1945. We'll start this time with America's Navy. During this time, America's Navy was rapidly expanding and was becoming a formidable force, increasingly around the world. This was in large part due to a work written by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a U.S. naval officer and historian who said whichever country had the largest and most powerful fleet would soon dominate the world. And so America started building up. Soon this buildup led to the Spanish-American War, when the USS Maine sank in Havana, Cuba, which was owned by Spain at the time. Americans were outraged at this ship sinking, shouting things like, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," and with the help of yellow journalism, or fake news as it's called today, the U.S. Navy soon entered and crushed Spain's fleet and took over many areas. During this time, future President Teddy Roosevelt led a charge on San Juan Hill. Soon after, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1898. Too many treaties of Paris, right? With this also came new Spanish colonies like the Philippines. The U.S. tried to imperialize the Philippines, but it was here they had to fight Emilio Aguinaldo, who was a revolutionary. Aguinaldo actually helped fight off Spain earlier with the United States, but now when the U.S. was trying to be imperialistic, he had to help rally his forces and fight the U.S. this time. Essentially, this was the beginning of a big imperialistic policy for the next few decades, and the U.S. was on its way to becoming more and more like the Europeans. Opponents formed, such as the Anti-Imperialist League, but were dismissed because they supposedly weren't patriotic enough. Jingoism was also a big term that existed during this time. The patriotism was called Jingoism because it was in the form of very aggressive, warlike foreign policy. After the war, Teddy Roosevelt was elected president. In office, he helped pass the Roosevelt Corollary, which was also known as big stick diplomacy. Basically, his idea was to carry a big stick in foreign nations and use your presence to scare the other countries into submission. Theodore Roosevelt was also an avid conservationist. During his time, big business and ranchers were tearing apart America's interior for natural resources, much like today. And he wanted to protect these areas and have responsible natural resource usage. So he started America's national park system, protecting parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone. Of course, this is still a very big thing today. Some people, and this is a big distinction, conservationists, wanted the lands completely free of human access. This was a good time in history for the environment. Taft was the next president, and he was a big president, as in his actual size was actually really big. Taft followed Teddy Roosevelt and advocated for dollar diplomacy, or using American dollars to convince foreign nations, especially in South America, to agree to U.S. demands. And this worked, of course, because, money talks. And following Taft was Woodrow Wilson, who implemented moral diplomacy. This was the giving of support only to countries with values similar to American democracy. No democracy equals no money. Make sure you know the presidents and the policies associated with them. Roosevelt was big stick, Taft dollar, and Wilson moral diplomacy. During this time, the U.S. also practiced an open-door policy with China, which you should have learned in world history, where different countries, usually European, would agree to share the different ports in China. The U.S. also agreed to a gentleman's agreement with the country of Japan, where the U.S. wouldn't restrict Japanese immigration, and Japan wouldn't allow more emigration to the U.S. Basically, Americans hated Asian immigrants during this time, so they wanted to ban without writing a ban. Let's go back a little bit to the progressive reforms during this period. This time was known to have a lot of muckraker reforms, which were basically reforms to clean up the dirty practices of big business. So Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives, which showed the tough inner city conditions that people were faced with and the child labor of the times. Ida Tarbell wrote about the monopolistic practices of Standard Oil Company, and Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which exposed the Chicago meatpacking industry. Reforms to child labor and antitrust lawsuits were soon passed after this. In addition, a big reform that passed during this time was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act in 1906 called for meat inspecting, while the Food and Drug Act called for better food regulation to not make people sick, and the eventual establishment of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration today. Now back to the future. So because of imperialism during this time, World War I started in Europe. Wilson had a big choice to make. He either had to aid the European nations or be isolationist, and most American citizens during this time wanted to be isolationist, so he stuck with that. However, events such as the sinking of the Lusitania passenger ship, which had many Americans on board by a German sub, and the Zimmermann telegram, in which the Germans told the Mexicans they would help take back the lands lost in the Mexican War if Mexico joined the Central Powers, convinced the U.S. that they actually needed to step in. So these were two main factors for U.S. entrance into the war. The U.S. entered in 1917, and the war finally ended in 1918, so they weren't in it for a very long time. General Pershing was a big figure in the short Western Euro war effort, so there's some person to know. And during the war, people were highly suspicious, and a committee on public info was created. The Espionage Acts were created to try anyone accused of helping the Central Powers. The War Industries Board helped industry organize the war effort by purchasing war supplies and controlling prices, so you don't have inflation. The first Red Scare also occurred during this time. It was created by an FBI agent named A. Mitchell Palmer, and he scared people into thinking anarchy, which is like people who don't want government at all, and communism, which just took place in the Soviet Union, was coming to America. And two Italian anarchist immigrants named Sacco and Vanzetti were actually tried and eventually executed for murdering a guard, supposedly, even though it was never proven. And so this really shows how fear is really entering into America during this time period. So after the war, Wilson wanted a series of resolutions he created called the 14 Points to be passed in order to have future peace. It included the League of Nations, but it eventually failed because the United States wouldn't even participate. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war, but the U.S. didn't sign that either, so eventually they had to opt for separate resolutions with Germany and Austria-Hungary, who they were fighting. Progressive amendments also were passed during this time, and there were a couple of them. So most notably, there were 16, 17, 18, and 19. 16 was the national income tax, which established an income tax for Americans to pay. 17 was senators would now be voted on through popular vote instead of through state legislatures. 18 was prohibition, with the Volstead Act being passed. Eventually this would be repealed. And 19 was women's suffrage, which finally gave women the right to vote. The Great Migration also occurred during this time internally as African Americans from the South left their sharecropping jobs to work in northern factories. So, also, immigration acts in 1921 and 1924 were the most restrictive to date, preventing groups from Asia and Southeast Europe, the Balkan region. The people from these areas were seen as undesirable, mainly because of their religion. A lot of people from these areas were Catholic and other non-Protestant religions. And in the battle for religion, the battle between fundamentalism and religious modernism played out in Tennessee. A schoolteacher, John Scopes, was convicted for trying to teach about evolution in the monkey trials. And this really brought about the discussion to America. What is the role of the government and religion? Like, is there separation of church and state? Well, that's really what this act was trying to discover. And after the progressive movements came a series of laissez-faire Republicans. And it was the 1920s, the roaring 20s, and business was good. People like Harding, who was the next president, came into power and were involved in scandals such as the Teapot Dome scandal, when he accepted bribes from oil companies to drill out west. And after him came Coolidge, who I guess was pretty useless as well. And then eventually Herbert Hoover, who helped pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised import duties to protect American business and farmers. While this seemed to be good, this protectionist trade policy didn't really help international economics, and soon Black Tuesday in 1929 crashed the stock market and started the Great Depression. So the Great Depression came, and people like Huey Kingfish Long, who was the Louisiana governor, advocated for a share or wealth plan, which was kind of like welfare for everyone, although he wasn't very successful in advocating this. However, FDR soon took this idea and soon campaigned for president, and along with his wife Eleanor was elected. And Long initially supported FDR, but soon hated him because they had a rift in how exactly a share our wealth plan should be implemented. In office, FDR started the New Deal, which was pretty similar, and it really wanted to provide the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So that's a big thing to note right there. And he started government organizations like the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and WPA, Works Progress Administration. Those are just some good ones to know, to get people working again. He also started Social Security to give old people money, which is a disaster today, by the way. It's expected to run out of funds by 2030. And also the Wagner Act was passed during this time, which allowed unions to collectively bargain against big business. John L. Lewis, who led the mine workers and eventually founded the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, they were really big during this time. Fair employment laws were also implemented. FDR tried to pack the courts by putting more people on the Supreme Court in order to pass the plans such as the TVA, AAA, CCC, WPA, but it ultimately failed. And the reason he wanted to pack courts was sort of to dilute the Supreme Court justices who were already serving on there for life, who a lot of them actually didn't like these New Deal programs. The Nye Committee was also formed during this time period, and it investigated why the U.S. got involved in World War I. And it found a big part was to help the munitions manufacturers, which is still a big thing today, this military-industrial complex. World War II started later in FDR's terms, and the U.S. once again tried to be isolationist. People like the pilot Charles Lindbergh practiced isolationism, which is putting America first. The U.S. signed a bunch of supposed neutrality acts, such as the Lend-Lease Act with Great Britain, which allowed the U.S. to send supplies in exchange for access to British ports and naval bases, but they weren't really neutral. FDR was like, this Lend-Lease is like, if your neighbor had a garden hose, you wouldn't bargain to let them use it if their house was on fire. That was the thinking at the time. The Atlantic Charter was a vision held by FDR and Churchill for goals for a new world order after World War II ended. And it was signed, but of course the war still wasn't over and the U.S. still didn't jump in yet. However, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii eventually got the U.S. involved. The U.S. started by relocating all the West Coast Japanese to the interior to prevent them from helping Japan. This, of course, was untrue, as most of these immigrants who came to the United States didn't really want to help Japan. And it was also pretty unethical, just removing people from their homes. And in Korematsu versus the United States, Fred Korematsu tried to challenge the order, but eventually he failed. And eventually FDR died soon before the war ended in 1945, but the war was still going on. And so Vice President Harry Truman took over, and he wanted to end the war quick and prevent mass casualties in a land invasion of Japan, as the U.S. military was really getting close to Japan, and the war with Germany, Nazi Germany, and the rest in Europe was already over a few months before. So Truman ordered the top-secret Manhattan Project to be implemented. And in this project, atomic bombs were dropped, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were basically obliterated. And finally, the war was over. And this was the only time atomic bombs have been used in history. So this has been APUSH Period 7, 1890 to 1945. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to hit that sub button if you haven't already, and like, share, and comment these with your friends. Period 8 is located here, so make sure to check it out as well. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.